Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1186 New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Kylie Manning and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Kylie Manning is a mid-career painter based in Brooklyn, New York. Her work is heavily informed by the atmospheres, latitudes, and colors present in the various geographies of her childhood. Using brushwork, light, and balance, the artist captures moments within her personal history, such as her time working on Alaskan fishing boats and memories of surfing in Mexico. Manning's oil paint compositions center on ethereal, gestural, and genderless figures within expansive, disparate landscapes. She purposefully leaves the origin, gender, and raison d'être of the forms within her paintings up to interpretation, allowing the viewer to step into her world, yet form their own reading of the work. And our host, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, is an artist living and working in New York City. She holds degrees from Dartmouth College and the Yale School of Art. She is the founder and publisher of the annual magazine Precog and a co-director of the artist-run art and music initiative Bomb Pop-Up. And with that, I will pass it over to Gaby to get us started.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today on the occasion of Kylie's show, which just opened at Pace in Chelsea on the ground floor. It's called There Is Something That Stays, and I really recommend that y'all go see Kylie's beautiful paintings. And it feels really special to get to do this so early in its run as a way of sort of getting into the show and kickstarting some conversations about it. Kylie's also a really dear friend and a painter that I've respected for a really long time. So this is an extra pleasure. So I wanted to sort of take a lead from the title of the exhibition. There is something that stays. Even in Magley's introduction of Kylie and her work, there's often the idea of something which remains, whether or not it's definable, and the influence of both landscape and memory onto Kylie's practice. And so, Kylie, I was wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about the important places in your life and how those different places have affected your work. It's a little bit of an origin story, but yeah, I think your work is so connected to the idea that there's a reference which is present in the work, which is not immediately recognizable, that it's worth sort of talking about how the many places that you have a connection to impact your painting.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks, Gabby, and thank you everybody for taking time today on a gray day. And yeah, I've been watching these episodes for a really long time, and am honored to be here today with the Brooklyn Rail. And I think anybody that knows me well knows how obsessed with Gabby I am. I think she's one of the great brains thinking and making and talking and writing about art right now. So to be able to kind of crack open our show at the very, very beginning of the show with somebody who knows the work so deeply is just a really rare honor. It's just an honor. So thanks so much to everybody. Yeah, so the question about landscape and memory, I think is yeah, I think that that's a really great place to start because I think so much about, I've been thinking so much about time in this new body of work. And so it relates all the way back to old family photographs, but also kind of comes into the moment of how I'm making them as quickly and as slowly at the same time as I possibly can. So I grew up halfway between Alaska and then down in Mexico. And I grew up, my parents were both art teachers. So I was always in their drawing classes since I was a little kid. I'd sneak into my dad's college classes and draw nudes when I was like a little child. And those atmospheres and the fact that I grew up between two latitudes has had a really big effect on how I think about painting. I think like a lot of people, the notion of being lost in nature, and specifically the landscapes that I grew up in that are so massive and encompassing, I've always felt my most connected when I'm really insignificant, the way that only nature can do it. And I think that really great art can strive for something not quite like that, but something alongside that, like kind of running near that or jogging with that. And I've always, for a really long time, thought that if I can capture a specific atmosphere with a painting, that then the mark making, the gestures, the line work, that can be wildly radical and varied because the viewer already has a lot of confidence in knowing exactly where they are by remembering when they were in a place just like that. And that's a lot connected to growing up working on fishing boats and being in the ocean all the time down in Mexico, and this sense of kind of always losing and refining your sea legs, which is something that only happens in specific perspectives.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, to hear you talk in those terms. A couple of things came up sort of as you were talking about those things. The first is the importance of atmosphere in creating, like, for lack of a better word, a vibe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, like, an experience that's affectively recognizable in the present tense, which then allows for other things to move around in different ways. And I was really interested, I think maybe some of the specificities of the many different places in your life is something that we can kind of bring up or tie in again later. But, hearing you talk about sea lights in the work, I think it's really interesting that often when there's a horizon line in your painting, it's like in the top, like fifth of the painting. So that even the way that you organize gravity in the work is like you put the anchor point, which is the horizon line, somewhere near, whether it's the horizon or a cloud, right? It's sort of like the structural grounding location of the painting happens in the upper fourth or fifth of it, so that the rest of the paint doesn't have to sit on a, like, it doesn't have to obey gravity in the same manner because like our center of balance is shifted high. And I was wondering maybe if you could talk about like your use of these different landscape compositional expectations, especially with regard to like how you make space in this way, and whether you're thinking about that as anchors in the work as well.
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple different things you made me think about, which is a big part of like when you get the whole thing of sea legs is you stop being seasick, and then when you go back to land and then get into like a small bathroom, you then start to really feel this sense of like you're about to pass out, or you can't refine your horizon line, and that's because your body has subconsciously gotten used to this wavering. And so I really liked that notion of perspective as both a drawing tool, an academic way to help us navigate the piece, but also a personal, as a personal tool as well, because I think that everything about the way that I go around the world is from being from multiple places. So it's always shifting, it's always changing, and it's always related to my a personal perspective. But then the drawing tool, these horizons do a really interesting thing. When you take them away, you get this sense of a piece being kind of macro and micro at the same time. If you wouldn't mind actually taking us to that first triptych in the first room, back up to, yeah, that one right there. So that one, for the most part, we have a little bit of it in the far right. We have that top horizon, and you'll start to see once you navigate your way around this piece, the perspective towards the horizon in these deep spaces never adds up to the perspective with which we're looking at the figures. So the figures only seem like they're breaking the fourth wall and shoved to the front because we have this sense of well, if the space goes on infinitely, then why are they shoved to the front like at a state in a stage or on a theater? But also the figure on the far right panel, we're looking down and we're looking up at the perspective. The figures, if you find that relationship in the middle panel, we're looking up at that. And then the far left gives us implications of something maybe connected to that line work, but also at the same time, as if we are having more like the overview effect, with which is what happens when astronauts leave our orbit and see Earth for the first time and look down at the estuaries and look down at the mountains and see that from miles away. So we have this bird's eye view that's something that's either at the inside of the body or miles and miles away. So the point is this triptych adds up, but it's 3 disjointed perspectives per each panel. So the notion is that as soon as we find ourselves, we're kind of like coming up from air or for air and then kind of swirling and drowning in it again. And those little bits of logic, like the horizon line at the top, will give us a little bit of a lightning rod, but it never quite adds up for the rest of the piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things which is interesting hearing you talk about it in these terms is, you know, this question of sea legs, and like when they're in effect and when they're not, right? Like what happens in the space when you come back onto land or when you get onto the boat is that actually, you know, like these experiences are quite disorienting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so in a certain way, I think that there's maybe a way of thinking about um, I think the spatial markers in your painting definitely as things that create that disorientation, because otherwise the framework for looking at the work might be something like gestural abstraction, where you don't have to think about the implications of different kinds of perspective orientations when you look at the work, right? So that in that sense, seeing the horizon line in this painting all the way up to the upper right is the thing that causes the paint to become the experience of watching the painting or looking at the painting become disoriented in relationship to it. And so I sort of leading from that idea, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about like the relationship between the gesture and the color in your work, which is so I think invested in an idea of painterly beauty and pleasure, and the kind of disorientation that happens when we don't know where we are.
Yeah, I love that idea. There's 2 different thoughts, which is I think I'm always really interested in, and it's constantly shifting, the question of how much orientation does a viewer want, expect, and actually need. And I think that's always shifting. And I have a lot of faith in viewers and their capacity to feel their way around a painting. So I think there's very little need to give much more than implications so that the viewer can participate a lot more fully. And that sense of orientation and things like color and draftsmanship can be these things to jump off of, but they're also vehicles to allow misbehavior and things shifting and kind of coalescing and then fracturing constantly with you, for you, and so that the painting always feels like it's that the stakes are really, really high. And I think that that's something that can't be faked and can't be redone. You can't find the way to make a piece shatter and crystallize and form and like you have to really know that they're about to fall apart and that they're also found in front of the viewers. So there's no sketches or predetermined things. And there's a slight whisper of a leftover quality from going to the academy and an academic sense of drawing, but also a conversation with that in color, where beauty comes into play and pleasure comes into play. And I think it's a very feminist perspective to always set up and recognize where power is and then destroy that power and question that power and make fun of that power. And I think that beauty and pleasure is one of those tools that women get really tired and annoyed of being minimized into those things. So the color quality is always looking at a way to invite the viewer and then to really I don't know, do something that's a little bit kind of exciting and kind of sneaky, the way that music sort of operates. Color has a capacity to be a part of us and inside of us, the way that, like, if we just get to know a song, we start to love it because we just became familiar with it. It doesn't really matter if we liked it at first, it just becomes familiar, and color can do that. We all have an innate relationship to color, so you can use color's subconscious hierarchy to toy with us and to make us question our assumptions. So things that you know, like pink and blue and these associations with what's feminine and what's masculine, color can play with that, and beauty can play with that, and pleasure can play with that in a way that makes us kind of start to question vocabulary that we assume should be associated with feminine or masculine. If a color feels loud or powerful or strong, why would we subconsciously associate that with masculine? If a color feels quiet or sensitive or I don't know, I'm looking at this one, and the whole thing is a different volume. So I guess the point is color helps us to sort of feel our biases in a way that it's a little bit more intriguing, I think.
Yeah, that feels like it has a lot to do, you know, color itself is something that I feel has a lot to do in your work with how you make things feel present, especially in relationship to these bigger gestures. I wanted to loop back really quickly to some of the ideas about disorientation, the way that you were talking about disorientation, what becomes destabilized, what doesn't. I think is just an important framing reference in terms of how to think about your work. The first of all being that, like, I think one of your first formal academic trainings was at the New York Academy, right? Although I know you were at also not just, you didn't just live in many different places, you also went to many different schools. But that also, after being at the academy, you spent a while in Leipzig, at least 2 years, right? A couple of years in Germany.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, you know, I've thought for a while that thinking about your work in relationship to some of the Leipzig painters helps me make sense of the way that you talk about disorientation and your expectation for fragmentation in the painting, even though that's something that feels like it's subtext in your work and not like the explicit strategy of a lot of those painters. But thinking about, for example, you know, like Neo Rausch's relationship to discontinuity, which in his work is obviously much more imagistic, feels as though it provides a kind of orientation to how you're talking about your desire for differentiation, multiplicity of especially spatial viewpoint and access points. And I was wondering maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the effects of German painting on your work.
Yeah. Well, I'll go get into that, but let me go answer one thing that you started with color and destabilizing. And I really like the idea of this notion of yeah, I think just kind of trusting that the viewers can handle being kind of shaken up a little bit more, and that we're all really used to being unstable, especially now. I would say we're almost, a lot of us are more familiar with a state that's constantly unstable. That's also something that comes from you know, destabilization you can think about in so many different ways, but it comes from constantly bouncing around as a kid. I'm always been really impatient, and I get really bored when I feel like a painter has figured out an idea and then they make an entire show showing that same idea. I think because I was bouncing around so much, there's a impatience in the work. But with that related to color, I thought I should speak to, I think the thing that makes them that pushes against that wildness or impatience that I have is within the color itself. Every exhibition, the pigment is ground from the materials where the show is going to live. So the New York show, the majority of our bedrock that I could grind was quartz crystals, tourmaline, and calcite crystals. So that that last piece that you showed, that diptych that was a little bit grayer and colder, that's a color palette that we all, number 10, the next one down, I think. That's a color palette that we all understand innately from our skyline and our soft sunsets, and because it has the most of the pigment and the powder and the crystals that we're literally in and on and around. So there is a capacity for color by capturing our latitude and our longitude, but also by including the actual bedrock of where a show is going to go so that it feels like it's going home. So this sense of me always bouncing around and not interested in home, only finding home in other people, is also balanced by or off put by the sense that the paintings are always going home. Leipzig and that whole experience was just awesome. It was 2010. There was this huge economic crash. Nobody was doing figurative painting at all at that time in New York. It was just a lot of people don't remember what that time felt like to be a young painter finishing grad school, trying to participate in an art world that was I couldn't get in any doors. I couldn't get in anywhere, and I couldn't get anybody to even look at the work. And at the same time, I was sent to Leipzig, which I had never heard of, to go paint along the new Leipzig school. And it was this huge factory. It's kind of like what Gaby and I paint in now. And everybody in the factory was amazing. So it was like this remarkable extension of a residency or a graduate program experience, because every day you'd have tons of artists passing by, fighting about composition, fighting about color, having wine, talking about theory all day. And it was people that had their relationship to the history of art was totally changed because East Germany was behind the wall. So the relationship to abstract expressionism kind of didn't exist, or it existed in these teeny ways, but we can't unremember that. But that never affected their relationship to how a painting can be weird. And that is something that, like, I think there's just a weirdness to the paintings that I think Gaby might have been politely getting at, that makes sense when you think about the surrealist qualities, the almost like Soviet painting history. There's just a really specific thing that happened. And also, I think the main thing is every painter is just going to go where a door opens. If a door opens, you got to do that residency, and you got to go there, and you got to move to that place and see how far you can run with that. And that drug me down to Mexico City and back up to Alaska to fish if I didn't sell any paintings, and then back to New York. It was always moving around where a door would open. But I went from finishing school to being around serious fucking painters that were also, like, there's no other way to say it other than like dick slinging painters. And they all took the work so seriously, and they all believed in the work. And I was included in all of these group shows with people I had admired my whole life just because of other painters. And so to be able to like walk around Chelsea now and see all of the great female artists that are doing these grand slam, huge, you know, Joan Jonas's show, Camille Enroe's show, like, but there's just so many that's just that wasn't happening 20 years ago. Like, it's such an exciting time to be showing in New York right now because I'm alongside so many great female artists. But I in my experience, my only chance and opportunities were going over there where people were seeing the work. So yeah, that was maybe a longer answer than you expected.
No, that's great.
So,
It's good to get, it's amazing to get the context. And again, I mean, anyway, I think it's really important, I think, for your work in part because you know, like your ability to handle paint is just really, really beautiful and so convincing and so seductive, right? Like the things that you were talking about earlier in terms of like how color affects us, how you can use color with and against expectations, right? Is something that I think you're also doing in terms of line and the expectation for pictorialism in these paintings, right? And getting into some of the conversations you're talking about in terms of how having a different history, right? Where you don't, the first read is an abstract expressionism when you look at a gesture or when you look at a kind of abstract intervention, I think can be really like to me it points towards some of the ambitions of your work. If you can go back 2 slides to the painting that has this like big purple, that one, perfect. The one of the things that's like really weird, for example, about this painting, right? Which I also think is important to talk about with Kylie's work because it's also so like gesturally and lyrically gorgeous. So like when I say weird, it's not like it's unconventionally beautiful, right? But that like this green, like this forest green section on the bottom left and like the magenta squiggles on the top right, are both located pictorially in terms of the way the color is arranged in the painting, right? But then they also stop referencing, right? It's like we have all of this energy in the center of the painting where you can start to pick out ideas about like where a figure is or how like legs come together, like whether there's like when I'm talking to Kylie, sometimes I'm like, there's one figure in here, and she'll point out and be like, there's 5 figures in there. It's like a very kind of interesting relationship to when and how you see bodies and parts, whether they're experienced in their entirety. But that looking at the way the rendering is built up in the center of the painting would lead me to expect a kind of stable rendering or stable space that encloses the figure around it, right? And instead of that, we get this sort of like washy color drag away, which emphasizes again this feeling, the idea of the feeling, the primacy of the experience over the quote unquote correctness of the image, where the differentiation between the kind of gesture that we see on the left and even on the top right and the gesture that comes from the middle, I think comes from this desire to combine different ways of laying down paint, different ways of making a painting, right? And sort of packing in all of these possible modes of difference and differentiation that you can, while still kind of like playing with the sort of pictorial expectation of a coherent or cohesive picture. And I think that there's a lot in your work that has to do with denying expectations, kind of presenting expectations and then undermining them. You've talked about a number of them. I kind of want to open it up from here. This has also been sort of an extended comment. But I wanted to ground some of the ideas that you were talking about in the history that you kind of became a part of when you went to Germany and then came back to the States inside of the kinds of moves that you're making in your painting as well.
yeah, God, I just love talking to you so much. Everything that you said was so wonderfully put. So I think a little bit of what I've been hinting at with this notion of perspective and something that that there's a element to the work that's private, and there's an element that feels like you're looking at a really loud, huge thing that also feels like maybe like a huge something that is not quite that the layers are opening up slowly. And I think that for me, that is more for the viewer to open it up within themselves rather than for me to kind of give a specific dogmatic path into it. So I think that part of that started in Leipzig, where when I went there, I remember being horribly embarrassed about who was the president at the time, and going there and finding that everybody was actually just really excited about the idea that I was a cowboy and the notion of the Wild West, which was only like 10 years within the United States. And then I started researching this notion, and I started finding out about Karl May and all of these writers that wrote all of these stories about the United States that shaped German culture, that he was making them up. He was pretending he was a travel writer and he was making them up. And then those stories were all turned into scripts for spaghetti westerns, which then inspired the movies that starred like Clint Eastwood and all of these notions of masculinity. And it was something that was really, really interesting for me as a painter who grew up thinking that I would have been friends with, you know, Turner and Pollock and all of these people that I had admired. And then the more that I learned about them, realizing that they probably never would have ever done a studio visit with me or ever been interested in the work. And so this notion of what is put in front of us and what is expected of us and what is assumed of us, I think I of course carry into the paintings from a standpoint of being really really irritated and frustrated because I had grown up with people that were much, you know, wilder and crazier and hunted and fished and done like survived these crazy storms, and then meeting these painters that were acting like they were wildly masculine was just seemed like bad theater. So this idea of intervention and kind of using all of the technical qualities of out kind of like, I don't know, kind of showing that strength or that tool is much sharper, but also that that's not necessary. And then kind of realizing that it became less and less and less interesting to be showing that capacity. So the draftsmanship is something that slows us down, holds us still, and becomes like a cluster of information. If we go back to number 10, please, because Gaby had got me thinking about that with that one in particular, on slide number 10, I think it was. Or 11, sorry. So this one, we get these little bits of information that Gaby's talking about that I'm washing away. So in the bottom right, in the white space, largest contrast between the white and the black, we have you know, kind of like the fat of a thigh and all of these things that feel like a much larger leg that is a different perspective of the figure behind. But then the actual quality of the paint is pouring over and washing out any sense of draftsmanship and therefore narrative. So the idea of adding up all of the times that drawing can imply a story and then breaking that down, I think is a really nice way and a really good way to kind of set up these clusters of information and then stop having it stop showing the same thing, that line can just be a compositional tool rather than something to unveil a moment. And then the washes are this pure abstract intervention, because the quantity of calcite crystals versus tourmaline is going to push the pigment so that it decides how much to bury, how much to cover up, how much to cut out, and then sometimes it'll start to come back.
Yeah, there's a painting, I think I think it's in this set of images, but there's one of the titles of the paintings is Pareidolia, which I think is really interesting, just as a pareidolia, what is it? As an effect, as a verb? as a
Mhm.
thing, right? It's like the practice of seeing faces everywhere, right? Which
Yeah,
also describes the way that you find figures in these paintings, or
yeah,
the ways that we the like how I think, you know, one of the ways to think about some of the information that you've been giving us is like, how little do you need to imply a landscape? Like, how little information do you need to give a viewer for them to see the ocean, right?
right.
How little information do you have to give a viewer for them to assume that something is a hand, right? And
Yeah,
what is this practice inside of painting, where we start to see ourselves or bodies or figures in inside of these constructed environments, which I think, you know, I guess in the scope of this question, I'm curious both about your practice in finding figures in the paintings, which really like starts from the ground up, right? Like you may have some ideas about what you want from a painting or a specific composition, but you literally find the faces inside of the splotches and splashes and gestures and accumulations of material on the painting. And then sort of secondly, and more broadly, I think that that kind of poses a greater question about what painting is in general, right? Which is this project of both material and illusion, and how it is that we assign uh, meaningfulness to the confluence of the two.
yeah. Um, for me, I think it's a little bit of what you were maybe getting at before, this idea of combining different marks and this notion of mark making as language. And then I think if we really think about it as like a haiku, if we can use pareidolia, which I often think about pareidolia in relationship to clouds, that, you know, as clouds are passing, we always find things in them because we yearn to connect and
Mhm.
we yearn to project. And for me, it's most successful in wood, in a knot of wood where it starts to circle, which I think is just the most beautiful thing, because it's often from the bird's eye view of the years of the wood, which show the age of the wood. So this idea of connecting a face with something that's been etched out over years and years and years, and you can tell the years there was lots of water and there was a drought because of the width and the circumference of those circles when it grew a lot that year. But if I'm anywhere and find a knot of wood, I'll immediately find a face and complete the face, and then fill in all of these forms around it. So it's very easy for me to always be pulling that out. But for that is more for an enticing quantity of form than for meaning. For
Mhm.
me, it's the reason of the figure is because the form is so unique. A landscape form lends my lines into specific things, and architecture lends it into a different way. But the figure creates a sense of, just for abstract shapes, the most exciting jump off point for a truly uh, uh, varied mark making.
Mm.
And that's so you they start to come out of the washes and the stains and the negative space, but then how they start to be composed starts to beg that question, which is more connected to the value, which is how much an object needs this quality of a window, how much we need to give something to latch onto for the eye. And if we can say less and less and less so, then those marks, like a haiku, every single word has to be far more important than something that's less concise.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you also, you know, there's often, without needing to know very much about the specifics of narratives, and you know, we've also talked about both the elements of the work that might be private, but also the idea of narrative as an expectation of painting. But that's still, when we look at, like, when I look at how you organize like clusters of figures as opposed to clusters of marks, like there are often like themes that come to mind, and they kind of have to do with like protection, like snuggling. You know what I mean? There's like there's groups that are like protective, snuggling, like about a certain kind of closeness, and then there are these other figures that kind of like live on the brink, right? Like there's sometimes like a hand that's outstretched, or kind of like figure that occupies like a sort of like lonelier position away from the pack, right? But there is kind of this dynamic between like packs of people, like groups of friends, communities, etc., and then this idea of protection and alienation in relationship to those groups that just come up in terms of how you organize the figures. Like there's a lot of this. There are a lot
Yeah.
of hugging gestures in the work.
Uh-huh. Well, that comes from a lot of different things. I remember always being quite young and finding it really boring that the only way that paintings were portraying relationships was sexual, and thinking that paint is already so sexual, so why does that need to be the theme as well as the medium? It just seemed redundant. So if paint is already serving sexuality, then the figures don't need to do that in my mind. So because I grew up in a huge family, I had all these old family photos of packs of figures all the time. And the more that I traveled, the more that I related to figures, was always obsessed with time. I had people taken away from me very unexpectedly and quickly. And so the way that the figures build up a painting now is more about souls and past lives, and this relationship to all of the previous lives kind of filling up a painting. So the notion is that a lot of these washes and these tides that we talk about, the figures are left more like a jetsam or a flotsam, but the painting also has these huge spaces of negative space, but it still feels full. And that's because the figures that didn't make it to the final iteration are filling up all of the layers below. So it's like the painting is packed with all of these souls that filled up the piece, even though they were taken out of the painting. They're still the building blocks and the architecture of the piece. And yeah, I like the idea of rafting up to one another. And I think especially with an exhibition in New York, I wanted to highlight the models and the people that inspire me, and the reason that we're here, which is these great creatives that were around. So one we had just been looking at was the model was with I don't know what it was called, Symbols in My Ears. I don't remember what slide number that was, but that one was inspired by Sarah Mearns, who's a principal dancer for the New York City Ballet, and she had just come out about being about her hearing loss over dancing for decades, and she's just an extraordinary dancer whom I got to work with on the project with the New York City Ballet, and just an incredible human. And she spoke about when she got her hearing aids put in for the first time, that the slight, soft pitter patter of the dancing shoes sounded like cymbals in her ears. So this noise in painting, and what Gaby and I were talking about as different mark making. I mean, a lot of people read that as musical shifts, crescendos, and varieties of sounds of things, colors and marks louder or quieter, or if one hand is working on one octave the entire time, and that's all the drawing marks that we're adding up in one section, then suddenly bring in a whole other octave and then an entire new instrument. So these kind of surprises that lead up for things that are unexpected, that I think you can read in a way that's connected to sound and to dance. And but that was about the fact that, coming back to that model sat for all the different positions in this painting. So we have like all these legs filling up and not adding up to the drawing of the figure above, but you get the sense that that was a figure from another time.
So I think one thing I want to kind of talk about as we sort of move into maybe to also thinking about your now substantial collaborations with choreographers in dance is the importance of other mediums in your work. You talk about poetry a lot. You talk about poetry a lot. This is the New York City Ballet collaboration that Kylie was just talking about. And in thinking about this, and your ideas about time, there are going to be a couple different things in here, which won't be surprising to you because that's just sort of how I talk and think, how we talk and think anyway. Um, but I was thinking about rhyme in your work, and the way that you are talking about abstract marks, recognizable marks, landscape mark, explicitly figurative marks, and how you talk about them in relationship to one another as though they're like echoing internal rhyme schemes in a poem, right? They're like different words with the same vowel formation or something like that. Um, and how, you know, like on a sort of like smaller, or not smaller, on the level of color, right? Color and material and format. This is also something that you do with whites. You know, it's like with the assumption that the wall is white, but also that the oil primer is a different kind of white that you play with in terms of how you apply whites on top of washes, how you put different tonalities of white on top of that oil ground, which feels like it has something to do with the play and poetics of how a painting is structured. I think we may have lost Kylie for a second, but I'm going to keep um, talking about that. Is that true? Is Kylie in here?
I'm not seeing her.
Sorry, guys, I don't know what happened. It just shut down and came back. Do you see me now?
We hear you, so that's good. um,
Um, I heard you right up to the white marks of what's below.
yeah,
I don't know what happened. It stopped
that
and
was
turned
it.
back on. Maybe it's because we've been on Zoom for a while. Sorry.
No,
Okay.
no worries.
Am I
Um,
back?
yeah, you're back.
Sorry.
No, no problem. So sort of taking this as a kind of as a model, right? Thinking about like rhyme as a poetic way of thinking about difference and differentiation in the work. I think there's also something about movement in your work, which is really significant even before you get into the idea of these objects literally being taken out of their own static duration inside of choreography. So there's a lot of references to movement in your work. And then you made these, I mean, the ballet sets were made for that performance. I think the pieces in Space K were, you had to consider both as a choreographic um, element as well as a spatial element in your show, right? They're both hanging paintings and also a stage kind of organization. Not I don't like using the word set in this case because it feels like the work is more active. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about movement in your work, and how your relationship to the time of gesture and the time of choreography, as you've worked on these projects.
Yeah. So in relationship to these dance pieces, that was all born because a choreographer saw my exhibition in LA, and he saw that everything that we think of as weather, movement, vocabulary, poetry, all of these cinematic references for me, he saw as sound. And he just knew perfectly that he and I would have so much in common. We had just done that exhibition was titled Both Sides Now, and he had just created a ballet to the same Joni Mitchell song. We just knew that we would connect, and so I got to design the costumes and make paintings that we recreated this massive, massive scale for the backdrops, and a similar thing with the Space K. Those were all what I would consider more like a painted sculpture, really, where you have this sense of like almost like a film strip that's been sliced over and over, so you can kind of zero in on the speed of one of the stills or expand out to the entire composition. But the notion of gesture and poetry, for me, I think a lot of it is because I kind of medicate with music in the studio. If a painting needs to be sped up or slowed down, I'll rely on music for that. And then I'm constantly listening and reading about what other artists are doing. But at the same time, because my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, I'm constantly just reading alongside. And then that sort of builds up this pile of titles and things that don't unlock the painting, but unlock something that is with the piece. And that's because I think the painting is just its own language. So to try to have a title cleverly unlock that is really not fair to the painting. So the poetry is more just something that is assists it. So I'm talking a lot about time lately, because these opportunities with dance afforded people to sit in front of paintings for a long period of time, something that they never have the space to do. I got to watch them unravel for all of these viewers. And at the same time, having a young child, I have really a relationship with time where it feels like it's racing past me and something that I can't get a good hold of. And because of that, I was reading these Borges poems about the night, where he talks about the fluidity of time and something that is it's fleetinglessness, but at the same time, there's always something that stays. And that's a little bit more connected to how I want to honor these figures, people, so that they can have more of a glacial relationship to time, and something that is just so rapid.
So I know we have
That even remotely answer your question?
I think yeah, I think it has to do with it gives us an insight into how you're thinking about these correlations, which I think is the point, right? To have the idea that the correlation between mark and gesture and figure might have a relationship to the correlation between like sound, word, and movement in space, or something like this, that you're thinking about them in a kind of dynamic relationship.
Well, you made me think of one thing, which is that the time, like, because my parents were art teachers and because these are ground pigments that take so much time, and the rabbit skin glue, all of that, like, there is this thing that each painting takes years, but at the same time, there's moments that feel as rapid as a sketch, and there's nothing ever flippant, but there's this pace that's wildly quick, that's like unraveling. At the same time, it's finding itself so quickly, but you can also feel like that took decades to build that up. So we have that correlation between this always being fast and slow at the same time too.
I have 1.5 more questions for you. The half one you'll laugh at, but the last question sort of that I wanted to ask you about is about the idea of doubling in your work. So a lot of your titles, both sides now, is a great example of one. You Within Me is a specific kind of doubling as well, right? I know that has many different possible implications, but I'm wondering if you might talk to us a little bit about the idea of doubles in your work, the idea, which I think has a relationship to the figures becoming sort of interchangeable with one another, and the way that identities are kind of also fluid and intermixed with one another. But how are you thinking about doubles and reproducibility in your work?
Doubling, that's a big part of growing up in Alaska, and this notion that we are only complete via our insignificance, I think. So the idea of identity is not something that I've ever been particularly intrigued by, because I think that it's about stepping back so that you can participate and hear all of these things around you in nature. So the doubling is about a little bit about if the object of the painting is both a window and an object and a mirror itself, the viewer is looking at themselves, and therefore the figures have to be everyone so that the viewer can participate, in which case the additive limbs are combined from different bodies. So you'll have things that imply femininity or things that imply masculinity, but they're added up together. So it never quite completes something that is not you. But the paintings themselves often double by like that diptych I Rorschach together so that it opened back up. And then titles just allow this notion that I think every painter hopes for, so that we see the surface of the piece and what's below the surface at the same time. And that just takes forever.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it kind of again in relationship to this sort of the conversation we were having about pareidolia, a word I always say incorrectly, which is like how much people want to be able to recognize something they know in an image, right? And that this way of this motivation in your work, I think, has less to do with the idea of like the universality of a figure and more about like the relatability of wanting to find something to relate to. And that like there is something that's profoundly relational about that desire, about wanting to see something that you recognize in an image and wanting for painting to play with you on that level, right? For like the idea that your work in some way has this generosity of spirit where you're like, there's something for you too in here, or like, I know you sort of know that you as an artist, I feel like know that that's something that people will want to find in the work and you're willing to give it to them on that level, which I think is a really interesting motivation in the work that I think, I think maybe relates to the kind of ethos of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, completely. I think we've talked a lot about this, how humanity is not really in vogue right now, but these paintings are not for now. They're for a long time down the road. And they come from a humble standpoint that I think people just kind of keep cruising past, and that they refuse to pass that. They really keep coming back to this notion of the fact that we have a lot more in common than we have separating us. The figures all pile together, we all come together, we all raft up together, we all need one another. It's a really, it all relates back to that first question of this. None of this falls very far from the tree of being a hippie's kid in Alaska, that these notions that I never saw in painting, and that are the world that I know, that are in all of my friends and all of the art community that I'm around. And I wanted to see that in painting.
I mean, I think that's really the best place to end this part of the conversation, and also in summation to conclude that your work is actually all about water. No, I'm totally just kidding. This is like a Kylie Manning tourism is the assumption that the work is about water, which, it is, but only metaphorically. Anyway, thank you so much, Kylie. And I think with that, we can turn it back over to the rail to facilitate questions.
Sure.
Thank you both so much for such an illuminating conversation. We'd like to remind the audience that there is a link in the chat where you can submit your questions. If you have a question for Kylie or Gaby, I'm gonna kick us off. I was wondering, Kylie, what does a day look like for you in the studio?
What does a day look like for me in the studio? Well, I start pretty early and take my little baby to daycare, and then I walk along this really shitty truck route from East Williamsburg to Richwood down the Graham Avenue, and usually getting like 3 fights with trucks along the way. And it's supposed to be like a clearing of my head, but it's just a way to get, in any weather, get outside and get some fresh air and shake a leg, so that I can kind of bring a clean head that's a little bit severed from home to the studio. And then I start with grinding pigments for a while. I think a lot about stretching and the rabbit skin glue processes and those things that are kind of more muscle memory as I'm looking at paintings that are shifting as the light's shifting across them throughout the day. So I try to make every body of work grow up together. So I never finish a painting and then go to the next one. I have one painting that's being started at the same time as one's 20% done, 30% done, until finished. So the goal is that something that is 90% done, I can bring the excitement of a brand new wash of that to the last hit of a painting. Yeah, so I usually start throughout the day with those things and then kind of try to do everything I can to kind of like let the plane take off in the studio. And then if I'm lucky enough, that happens a couple of times a week and I stay all day and through the night often to move a piece forward as far as I can when it's happening.
Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
Next question is from Kate Sherman. Kate says, can you talk a bit about the production of the large-scale painting for the ballet? Did you use all the same materials or in just larger quantities or different materials and different tools?
So for all of those large scale pieces, we had three different materials. The ones for this museum in Seoul, we used silk, and those silk strips, that was the maximum size. And we could have sewn them together, but I wanted to keep them separated so it felt like you were seeing a still of a film strip that was something that was a full image, but also something that you could literally come inside of. And then the ballet actually had two different backdrops. One was on a sheer shark's tooth muslin, which is a really, really, really loose weave, much looser weave than a burlap or anything like that. And the quantity of the weave allowed for that first one to be translucent. And then the one behind it was a much thicker cotton duct canvas material so it's different materials. So the ones behind me are everything's oil on a certain Belgian linen. And those had to be much more durable and yet at the same time a lot lighter.
Thank you. The next question is from Kelly, and Kelly is wondering what you find to be the biggest obstacles to creating work these days.
I mean, I think New York right now is in a really financially difficult time. It's really, really hard on artists. And I think that Gaby does really great work about that every single day, trying to find ways and spaces for artists to be able to maintain their studios. I think that's a really impossible thing that's happening in New York right now. But I think the biggest challenge is trying to get people to spend a little bit more time with it. They always want to like skip right past and they got things to do. And that was the nice thing about the ballet is people sat down and spent time with the pieces. So to get people to basically sit down and have a glass of wine in front of a painting and just let it unravel for them, that's I think the biggest challenge. And I think every painting deserves just giving it a little bit more time.
Thank you. The next question is from Min. I'll let you unmute, Min.
Hi, Kylie and Gabby. Thank you so much. I loved hearing your conversation. My question's kind of like a follow-up of the two questions. I loved the way you described sort of the way in which like the ballet allows paintings to like reveal itself over time. And I was curious about lighting. I'm not sure about like the technicality of the lighting within like a performance space, but I felt like there was more variety in lighting when looking at your work as a backdrop to a performance. And I was wondering if that sort of challenges you or influences the way in which you think about lighting, because oftentimes when we're in a gallery space, I feel like the lighting is quite consistent and fixed, whereas within a performance space, that's not the case. And I was wondering if and how that influences the way you think about lighting.
Well, you're absolutely true. You're right on with that. So that ballet was, the lighting designer is Mary Louise Geiger, who's an extremely talented lighting designer. And if she could light anybody's paintings ever, you would be just on cloud nine, because she's so talented, and the pieces absolutely shifted and glowed and changed based off of where the warmth and the cold and the spot, like all of that was constantly allowing the pieces to blossom and change in order to help that that specific Schoenberg score for that piece. And because I'm so lucky to have great natural light in my studio, I get to watch the sun do that to the paintings all the time. So because these paintings are so translucent, all of the paint is done in a similar way to the sfumato effect, where we see hundreds and hundreds of layers of safflower oils that are as thin as a strand of hair. The layers actually allow the light to refract. So a painting feels like it's glowing from within because of that use of the whites that Gaby was talking about, but also because of the layers that are not just passing through and bouncing back out, but bouncing within themselves. So part of that is the technical quality of the style of painting that needs good light. So I think my installations in general for galleries, it takes about 1 day to hang everything and 6 days to light everything, because I'm working so much on the light, and I don't light like most people. I don't want an overall overlight. I want each painting to be no light anywhere else in the gallery, and then each painting to be looked at for a long, long, long time. And that's just I did that before the ballet, but seeing the ballet and seeing how well she did it was a real joy. Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Min, and for that answer, Kylie. The last question is from an anonymous audience member who is wondering what you're reading right now.
Well, I feel like this actually gives me a perfect segue into, I've literally got the two things that we were just talking about before, but this is Borges and Elaine de Kooning and her spirit of abstract expressionism. In this, I don't know how very few people know about this, but in this, Elaine did a list where she distilled some of her favorite painters into a couple of their favorite things about them. And so the list is titled Pinup Boys, which I think is so perfect. And she's got Michelangelo. Her favorite thing about him is his ability to rock and roll. Cézanne's is for his ability to be King Lear. Renoir is for not caring, and Van Gogh is for caring. Pollock was for rocking the boat, and Gorky was for knowing so much. So there's quite a few of them, but I don't know. I think it's just the most incredible little bit of text where she highlighted all of these people. And Gaby and I are going to play with that notion in the fall as well. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kylie and Gaby. This was such a delightful conversation. I'd also like to thank Sarah from Pace Gallery for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Nick Mouse, Ken Okishi, and Barbara London on the occasion of their exhibition at the 303 Gallery. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all turn on your cameras and mute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you,
Bye.
Kylie and Gaby. That was
Bye-bye.
amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Great
Thank
discussion.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.